Today, we arrive in our exposition of the Gospel of Luke to sacred ground. It's a hill outside of Jerusalem where the greatest transaction in history will take place between God the Father and God the Son. Luke refers to this hill as simply the skull. The Greek word is kranion, which gives us our word cranium or skull. We're not exactly sure why the hill earned this nickname, unless perhaps this rocky hilltop resembled at some point in time a skull. The Aramaic word for skull is Golgotha, which Matthew, Mark, and John use in their account. The Latin word for skull is Calvaria, which gives us the word Calvary. That word will be adopted as the more general term chosen by the church for this sacred ground. This is the hill that Jesus must die on. This is the hill Jesus will die on. This is the place where Jesus will become that climactic, that final Passover lamb. I have to tell you, beloved, this is such a momentous passage. I've struggled with how fast to move through it. You know, I usually speed through the scriptures. Now I'm wondering how slow to go, where and when to pause. Frankly, I could preach from this and the next chapter for the rest of my life and never reach the bottom of the well of this deep truth and grace and glory revealed to us about our Lord. This event is both horrifying and healing. It represents our sin and our salvation, our guilt and our guarantee. This is where we're going to be shown in living color that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And I'm praying for you that if you do not know the Son of God, that you will leave here knowing him, believing in him, trusting in what he did for you. This is the place where the last lamb will be sacrificed for all time. This is the place where the sinless lamb will die for sinful humanity. This is the place where death will pave the way to eternal life for those who believe. And I think of the fact that this is the place where the flames of God's wrath will be extinguished for those who believe in the blood of the Lamb. Now, following the prisoner exchange of Jesus Barabbas for Jesus the Christ, which we studied last Lord's Day, Pilate, according to Matthew's gospel account, is sending Jesus now to be scourged. This may be one last attempt to satisfy the growing mob who wants the death of Jesus, no matter what Pilate tries, and even this scourging is not going to work. Now, during the days of Christ, this horrific beating was commonly referred to as the halfway death. And that's because many victims would slip into a state of shock. It was not unusual for someone to die while being scourged. Now, I'm not going to attempt this morning to be graphic for the sake of sensationalism, but I do not want to sanitize it either. This is all included in the suffering of the Lamb. Before scourging, we know from history, the victim would be stripped of his clothing and then bound to a low stone post. The men who administered the beating were known as lictors, which is where we get our phrase, he took a licking. They were trained in this. Scourging was the standard practice that preceded crucifixion. And typically, 2 Roman soldiers would alternate their blows. They would both use a whip called a flagellum. It was a short, wooden-handled instrument with long leather straps, whip-like. The straps were braided at alternating lengths, and pieces of sheep bone and pieces of metal would be sewn into the braids. Several years ago, a detailed report on the medical aspects and impact of scourging was published by the Journal of the American Medical Association. It describes the scourging as follows, and I'll simply read a paragraph. As the Roman soldiers repeatedly struck the victim's back with full force, the metal and bone would cut into the skin and underlying tissues. As the scourging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce ribbons of bleeding flesh. Pain and blood loss generally set the stage for circulatory shock. The extent of blood loss may well determine how long the victim would then survive on the cross. Now, if you read the accounts, there's no doubt that Jesus would have endured a most terrible beating, given the fact that these Roman soldiers were demonically inspired without understanding the reasons why to hurt him. Add to that the fact that the Roman soldiers hated Jews. Matthew, in fact, tells us that it wasn't just a couple of lictors out there to engage in the scourging. Matthew tells us that an entire battalion came out there to watch, to get engaged in mocking the Lord. They're all mocking this king of the Jews. Some had already gone out to gather some thorns. These particular thorns were about 6 inches long. They were common in this region. They were clipped and then dried, used as kindling. Public areas would have receptacles of these, stocked with thorn branches and vines. Some soldiers evidently then had gone out and grabbed some of them and plaited together a wreath to shove onto the head, mocking him as a king, and this would be his crown. Matthew describes it in chapter 27 and verse 28, and they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and they put a reed in his right hand. Now you need to understand the scarlet robe is mockery regarding his claim of royalty. Now, it wasn't a long robe you would see in the medieval classic paintings or renderings. The Greek word used here refers to a short cloak without arms, it just wrapped around. It was used by high-ranking military personnel and even royalty, and purple indicates the royal color. This wrap would have just covered the shoulders. It would be held in place by a button at the neck or a tie of some sort. It would not extend below the elbows. So Jesus has been stripped naked to add to the humiliation of this scene. The wrap is now put around his shoulders, which doesn't reach past his stomach. A reed has been put in his right hand to mimic a royal scepter, and this crown of thorns has been jammed down on his head. Matthew records next, and kneeling before him, imagine this battalion kneeling, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." And then they spit on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And Then after they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes back on him and led him away to crucify him. And what is he doing during all of this? He's dealing, no doubt, with searing pain, blood running down his face, his back, his stomach, chest, down his legs. What's he doing? He's standing here quietly, perhaps groaning in pain. But he's standing here as a lamb that is led to the slaughter, as a sheep is silent before its shearer, so he opened not his mouth. Isaiah 53:7. Perhaps he's looking down the corridor of human history to that moment when every knee will bow and every tongue confess that he is Lord. Now at this point, as Jesus begins walking to Calvary, Luke introduces us to a bystander who suddenly becomes a key player. Unwittingly, it'll change his life. Luke writes in verse 26, and as they led him away, they seized one, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, that is, he's traveling now here, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. By the way, the gospel accounts never refer to Jesus falling while trying to drag a cross through the streets and up the hill. In fact, no crucifixion victim carried their cross that would have weighed more than 300 pounds. They carried the cross beam. More of that in a moment. Now, evidently, the centurion knew right away that Jesus would be unable to carry anything because he had been so horribly beaten, experienced so much blood loss. So he drafts this man named Simon. Now, there's a little irony here, isn't there? Just want to mention very briefly, because you might wonder where the other Simon is. You know, the one that proudly declared he would follow Jesus to the death. Simon Peter is missing. This is Simon of Cyrene. Now, the fact that he's mentioned by name lets us know he became well known to the believers. In fact, in Mark's gospel, Mark even gives us the names of his sons, Alexander and Rufus, meaning they were also known to the believing community. Add to that the fact that Paul, as he wraps up the book of Romans, writing to the church in Rome, he makes a special commendation to the mother of one of the sons, Rufus. She acted as a mother to Paul, blessing him uniquely. She was a special member of this believing community. One author writes that apparently Simon and his wife and his two sons became well-known Christians held in honor in the church. Well, Simon, we don't know if his wife and boys are with him, but Simon has traveled to Jerusalem from Cyrene. That's 800 miles away. Cyrene is a Roman district in the modern country of Libya. A large number of Jews, we know from history, had settled there about 300 years before the birth of Christ. Now, attending Passover as a Jew was what we would say today was on the bucket list of every devout Jew. They wanted to celebrate Passover at least one time in their lifetime in the city of Jerusalem. So he's traveled here hundreds of miles. Now, we don't know if this is his first visit, but we do know that this is his most significant visit. He'll never get over it. He's arrived, maybe swept up with a crowd that's gathering, a crowd that is talking, buzzing about the crucifixion of a Jewish man, and that is highly unusual. The Mishnah records for us that the Jews would execute a criminal one of four ways, and crucifixion was not one of them. And for someone guilty of blasphemy, which Jesus was, according to them, he'd be stoned to death. This one is going to be crucified. And all of a sudden, at some point, Simon feels the flat edge of a Roman sword, which was legal conscription into Roman service, and he's commanded by the centurion to carry what Jesus would have carried. So here comes this procession. Get the real picture in your mind. There's a Roman soldier among the four assigned, plus a centurion. The one in front would be carrying a titulus, the Latin word for a placard, and written on it, typically made of wood, would be written the crimes of the condemned individual. It would be held, in fact, attached to a pole and held high by that Roman soldier, so all the crowd that had gathered to watch the procession would know why he's being crucified. What terrible crime he had committed. The gospel accounts tell us written on that simply were the words, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Now, John 19 tells us that Pilate ordered it to be written in three languages: Hebrew, the language of the nation Israel; Latin, the language of the Roman Empire; and Greek for everybody else, the language of the known world. It would later be attached to the cross. So Pilate, in fact, he knew that this would infuriate the Jewish leaders. In fact, they tried to get him to change it. And he said no. In fact, John records for us in chapter 19 and verse 22, Pilate says, "What I have written, I have written." So that soldier carrying that pole and the titulus with that message, this would have been very public. The streets are packed with people, and following that Roman soldier would typically come the victim. But follow this. Even though carrying that crossbeam is coming later and Jesus is walking directly behind the Roman soldier, keep in mind that according to the government, the carrying of this crossbeam to the hill of crucifixion communicated to the public that this person was guilty. Guilty. But just think of the irony then. Jesus isn't guilty. He's not carrying this. Mankind is guilty. So here you have, ironically, Simon becoming a representative of guilty humanity, walking behind Jesus, and Jesus is simply walking underneath that placard that declares the reality of who he was, King of the Jews, in three languages. I guess you could say that this placard was the first gospel tract written in three languages, free of charge. In fact, get this, it was composed by a pagan politician. Just one more reminder to me that God has a way of overruling the rulers of our world in every generation, in every country. That's a good reminder of this coming Tuesday. God is in control. Now, you ought to exercise your right as a citizen and vote. It happens to be the most dignified way you can speak your mind. But don't lose hope, no matter whatever the outcome is. God has a way of overruling the rulers. God is not going to stay up late on Tuesday night to see if his agenda can keep going, wringing his hands. In fact, he has already appointed every winning candidate. whether we vote for them or not. Here he moves the heart of a pagan governor, an unjust man, to spell out the gospel in 3 languages. Now with that, Luke introduces us to some additional bystanders, verse 27, and there followed him a great multitude of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Now, these women are weeping over the injustice of what they knew to be the injustice of Jesus and his death. Jesus is looking ahead about 35 years to the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the horror of what that's going to mean as thousands of people are killed, including women and children. The nation of Israel is like a green tree during the ministry of Jesus, fruitful, the blessing, the opportunity, the miracles and the signs and the wonders. But they reject the Messiah, and when they do, as one author writes, they became a dry tree, fit for the fire that's going to come of predicted judgment. That judgment predicted by the Lord is going to arrive when the city is besieged by the Roman general Titus. The people inside the city will begin starving to death. They will cannibalize their babies. Eventually, the city will be overtaken, and Titus will crucify thousands of these Jews, destroy the temple. In fact, Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, wrote that Titus stopped crucifying the vanquished Jews only because he ran out of wood. Jesus is grieving over the nation that has rejected him. Well, eventually the procession reaches Golgotha, the skull. Luke writes here in verse 32, 2 others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. We talked about last Lord's Day that these were the partners in crime with Yeshua, Barabbas. And when they came to the place that is called the skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Crucifixion originally referred to nailing someone to a tree or to an upright stake. In fact, the Greek word for tree and wood is the same word. And to this world, a tree and a cross made of wood were synonymous terms, which is why you'll read in the scriptures, in fact, where Peter writes that Jesus bore our sins in his body on the tree. 1 Peter 2:24. The crucifixions were invented by the Persians because they worshiped Ormuzd, the god of the earth, or the earth was that god. They didn't want to contaminate the earth, their god, and so they devised a way to take someone's life, elevate it above the surface of the earth so it wouldn't supposedly contaminate earth. They typically nailed the victim to a stake, elevated so that the victim was above ground. This practice traveled to other lands over time, kingdoms, centuries, until the Romans adopted it, but adapted it to make the victim suffer even longer. In fact, it became such a horrific way to die that Cicero, the Roman orator, once said, the very word cross should be far removed, not only from the person of a Roman citizen, but from his thoughts, his eyes, his ears. The very mention of the cross is unworthy of a Roman citizen. In fact, it will become the worst way to curse someone. Someone today in our generation might tell someone to go to hell, which is a way to disrespect or demean them. But that in no way even compared to the idea of telling someone to be crucified. In fact, in Pompeii on a wall was graffiti found before it was buried in lava. Simply that expression, be crucified. The Latin verb form of crucifixion means to torture, and that's exactly what they designed it to do. Now, let me make sure we understand that for Jesus, crucifixion was necessary not because it was painful or humiliating or slow. It was necessary because the law revealed that someone killed in that manner was rejected by God. You go back into the law in Deuteronomy chapter 21, which stated that someone hanging on a tree, someone crucified, was cursed by God. That's what the Apostle Paul had in mind when he wrote to the Galatians in chapter 3 and verse 13. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. And then he quotes Deuteronomy 21. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. And that's the point. This is why, by the way, the Jewish leaders are determined to crucify Jesus, not stone him. If they can crucify him, it will be irrefutable proof that Jesus was not just a blasphemer, but that he was utterly, entirely rejected by God, which means he's not the Son of God. He's not the Messiah. He's not the King of the Jews. Just look at the hill. Look. He died on a cross. He's accursed. He's rejected by God. That's sort of the end of the story. The case closed. And to this world, it would indeed be the end of the story. They had no idea that Jesus planned to be rejected by God the Father. That was the plan. To become the curse, the cursed one, for our own sake and for our forgiveness. Now let me take some time to correct the mental picture many people have of this scene. As I mentioned, a Roman cross weighed around 300 pounds. The victims did not drag a 300-pound cross hundreds of yards and then up a hill, especially those who were suffering, of course, from the blood loss and pain of scourging. Now we know from both Jewish and Roman historians that the vertical piece of the cross was permanent. At the site of executions, there would be dozens of them. We know from history that thousands of people were crucified during the lifetime of Jesus. This is Rome's favorite way to put somebody to death. It was a public way of saying, never defy the Roman Empire. Jesus would have been carrying the cross beam, the patibulum. I've asked Ryan to illustrate this by carrying the patibulum down the aisle here to the platform. The Romans would place that beam on the ground, and then they'd place the victim on his back. That beam averaged about 100 pounds in weight. The centurion knew Jesus couldn't carry that. That's why he enlisted Simon of Cyrene. Typically, the condemned criminal would carry the beam to the side of the crucifixion. After walking some distance, you can imagine I'd struggle under the weight. I had to find someone young enough and strong enough to do this, and none of us elders qualified. the cross was constructed with a mortise and tenon joint. In other words, the crossbeam had a hole in the center of it, and it would be taken and it would slip down over the vertical beam. Go ahead, gentlemen, and relieve Ryan. Now again, after nailing his hands to this crossbeam, he would be stood up, his hands raised up with that crossbeam, and then it would be put down over the stipe. Now, recent discoveries and historical research indicate that the nails would have been driven through the hand. If you look at your hand and you sort of cup it, you have a little valley right here. That's where the nail would enter. And then they would nail it at such a way that it would exit through the wrist, affixed to the crossbeam. Now, there's one piece of the cross that's typically left out, and I think it's unfortunate that it is. It's called the sedile, which gives us our word saddle. It was a block of wood, which we show here, upon which the victim perched, just enough wood to rest upon. This enabled the soldiers to then draw up the knees of the victim and place his feet flat against the beam and then drive a nail through each foot. Sometimes the soldiers, wanting to be cruel perhaps, would swivel the body and overlap the feet and then drive a nail through the ankles. Later in Luke's account, Jesus is going to show the disciples his hands and his feet, which indicates they were nailed individually. The saddle also allowed the victim to live for quite some time. One Bible scholar, late Bible scholar, Merrill Unger, writes that instances have been found in historical records of people surviving for 9 days on a cross. Again, it was designed to be the slowest, most painful way to die. Now, if the Romans needed the cross for the next person, they would push the victim off the saddle, break his legs, which would allow him to be unable then to raise himself up, to inhale and exhale, and he would be dead in a matter of minutes. Another mental picture that needs correcting is the dimensions. This is not a 12-foot tall cross. The Romans, that became popular, by the way, in the Middle Ages. The Romans used a cross, most often like this one's, a tau, Greek letter for a T. It would be no more than 6 to 7 feet high, maybe 8 at most. This would allow the people to come by and look him in the eye, to curse him. Perhaps the family members of someone he murdered, to spit on him. This will happen to Jesus. It also allowed victims to die, and most did, many did, by being attacked by wild animals at night who would eat them. One historian wrote that vultures would circle above the scene of a crucifixion, waiting for the crowd to leave. The Apostle Paul, writing in Philippians chapter 2 of the humility of Christ and his willingness to die, like this, said that he was obedient to the point of death, and then he writes, even death on a cross, as if to say, even if you can imagine it, this kind of death. But he couldn't be stoned to death. He couldn't be drowned. He had to be crucified. He will fulfill the law by becoming accursed by God on our behalf. So we will never be cursed by God. This is not an accident. This is a sacrifice. This is the final lamb dying for us. I often think of that singular illustration when Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh were married in 1947. I've read that the parks and streets in London were packed and jammed with people jostling for a glance at the royal carriage as it whisked the couple away, the horses, the soldiers. Royalty and dignitaries from around the world had arrived to see this, and among them was King Faisal II. He was 12 years old, king of Iraq. He had refused to wear his royal apparel. In fact, he didn't even want to be there. He didn't care about the wedding, but he did want to see the horses. So he pushed his way through a line of policemen to get a good look and was treated roughly, unkindly, until they found out who he was. The next day, the London newspapers headlined an apology with the words, "We're sorry, we did not know who you were." That's Jesus here, isn't it? Unrecognized, disbelieved, mistreated, mocked, more importantly, cursed by God the Father, accursed for us. He's willing to be rejected on earth and by his Father, so we will not be rejected in heaven by our Father. And for those of you who've come to this hill, who've come to Calvary, and you've trusted in his death for your life, well, then he's coming for you. One day, either through death, which he conquered, or the rapture of the church, for which we wait today. But I like to think of the foot of this cross being an illustration. It touched earth as if to declare that God had moved to touch mankind, and the arms of the cross stretch outward as if to say, "Whosoever will may come." I trust you've come. And this sacrifice paid the price for your redemption.